Hey guys, it's Etor. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to ask you something. What's your story? We all have one, and sometimes it takes the right space and a little guidance to bring that story to life. That's why I created the Ink and Authenticity Men's Creative Writing Workshop. It's a unique space for men to explore their identities, reflect on personal experiences, and use writing as a tool for self-discovery. Whether you're an experienced writer or have never written a word, this workshop is for you. Join me and other like-minded men on this journey. Visit authenticityroad.online/workshop to learn more. Thanks. And now on to today's episode. We talk a lot on this show about men doing their personal development work and seeking to become the best versions of themselves. We discuss techniques and modalities. We talk about the tools we teach and the behaviors we seek to model. But what does it look like when a man actually does the work and applies these skills to his life? In this episode, we welcome my friend and men's work brother, Ross Taylor. Unlike many of our guests, Ross is not a professional in the field of personal development. He's neither a coach, facilitator, nor author. He is, to my mind, something much more impressive. He's a man who has applied his learnings to change his life for the better. Ross is an articulate and insightful proponent and practitioner of the work. We think you'll find him not only an affable and charming fellow to spend some time with, but also a relatable everyman who is making the journey toward his best self. So let's get on the road. Welcome to the Authenticity Road podcast.
We started this podcast to share our stories and hear from others about their adventures in men's work.
Join us on the journey to our fully authentic selves, emotional healing, and the meaning of modern masculinity.
Here on Authenticity Road.
Hello, and welcome to the Authenticity Road podcast. I'm Etor, and this week on the podcast, we are delighted to have Ross Taylor. Ross is a men's work brother of mine. Among the many roles he plays in his life are a dad, a son, a brother, and a friend. He is an Englishman in Austin, Texas, by way of Portland, Oregon. Ross is with us this week, not because he has a book to flog or a podcast to promote, but simply because he is a man dedicated to men's work, to doing his work, and who is a shining example of what happens when we do our personal work to become the best versions of ourselves. So, Ross, welcome to the show. It is a delight and a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Ito. It's lovely to be here. And I really feel the charge already with those compliments of yours. So thank you so much. It's very kind.
Well, I hope that you will accept them. I hope you'll take them and integrate them, and that there's no resistance there. First of all, I just want to express my sincere gratitude for you being here. I know that with a family and a job and all of that, it's difficult to make time for these kinds of things. So I really want to recognize that and honor you and say thank you and offer you my gratitude. So as we jump into this, Ross, what are the things that you would want our listeners to know about you?
Yeah, well, thank you. And so, as you mentioned, I'm a bit of a foreigner by Austin standards. Lived in the US since 2014, and obviously had to make some big life decisions to leave friends, family, and everything else behind back in the UK. And I'm 43, nearly 44 years old, with a couple of young kiddos and an incredible wife. And have the good fortune of kind of finding men's work in the past year and really feeling that sense of elevation and connection, and also recognizing that there's so much value in having relatable exchanges with other men. And hopefully there's a story there somewhere where, someone can learn or benefit or be served by, my experiences in the same way as I benefit and I'm served by others.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about that past year in men's work. How did you find your way? As I often say, I found my way here by accident. So how did you find your way into the world of men's work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I found my way by good fortune. It was actually my wife who found a local men's group flyer on a wall at a meditation or or yoga lounge that she was at, and she kind of said, "Hey, I think this would be a good thing for you to go to explore." And so I had that unwavering kind of support from minute one. Now, if she kind of realized at that point that a year later I'd be on a podcast talking about it, then maybe she probably wouldn't have signed me up or volunteered it. But, we'd been through, a lot together in the 2 years or so through the pandemic. I lost my mother, we'd moved across from different states. And it was just that mechanism I found that was a good way of trying to meet new people initially, locally. That was the main plan. But beyond that, also recognizing that there was some real depth and goodness in having conversations with people that just had more significance and, going beyond the kind of, let's talk about the weather at school drop-off type conversations, and really needing that support was very evident very quickly for me. I stumbled into it. I recognized from early stage that, there was this foundation around everyman that really was kind of pivotal to it. So I signed up to the site, did my fundamentals course. And around that time, a local Austin chapter kind of was reignited. Brent Beckman, who you hosted a few weeks ago, was pivotal to that. And we've cycled through 12 or 13 folks, but we're really landed on a really strong chapter of about 8 people, and we meet weekly, and I'm really fortunate to be, in a city where that's supported, and there's a lot of great growth from each of the men in that room, and it really drives the accountability and hope, I think, as we kind of transition through these difficult periods of life.
Yeah. Brent's a real powerhouse, and I knew that he had a local group in Austin. I don't think that until I met you at Melt that I had made the connection. And we'll get into the Melt thing later in the episode. It's definitely on the list of things that we need to talk about. But it's interesting, isn't it, that how once we make connections with men and are able to talk about these very deep things, that suddenly nothing else will do. Like that suddenly it's just so hard to have a conversation with someone where it's going to be about the weather or about sports or whatever, be real with me, right?
Yep.
The 2 years preceding the pandemic, you had some kind of difficult times, and I'm wondering if you can go into that a bit.
Yeah, most definitely. I think the pandemic was a difficult period for everybody, so I certainly recognize that. For me, it's definitely not on my highlights reel. Those 2 years or so. I had the blessing of the arrival of my second child right at the beginning. So he was born in January, and most lockdowns started around March. And then around the same time was the sort of late stage deterioration of my mum's Alzheimer's, and ultimately she passed about 18 months later. So my pandemic experience was largely living around, baby to super minor, and then getting word from the UK that things were pretty dark. And that compounded with, all the other areas of the pandemic challenges for most, and fear and death at every door, at every reference, and trying to function as a provider, as an employee. It certainly presented me in a period of life which was undoubtedly the most difficult. And I knew that there was sort of strange things going on, inside. I just couldn't really place it. I couldn't place it physically. I certainly couldn't place it emotionally. And it's only with retrospect I can look back and think about that period of time where, it was shame that was showing up in many instances, especially where, I'm still ashamed to say, I kind of was somewhat detached from my son in those early months, probably the first year. This miracle, this bundle of joy, and I'm fortunate enough to say I've got a great bond with him now. But back then, it just, it's always going to sit with me that it wasn't an inviting period. for me to be living around a child with sleep regression.
Yeah.
So that was the challenge.
Yeah. I want to get into that for just a second, and we won't delve too deeply because I'm sure it's painful, but what was behind that disconnection? What was it that was driving your inability to maybe have the bonding experience that you would have thought was ideal?
Yeah, I think it was less about him. I think it was more about the other circumstances in my environment, and he just was the recipient of that reaction. So in some ways I feel somewhat at peace with that, knowing that, I was reactive to the environment of the pandemic, plus, the news in relation to my mum's situation. And it was less about him. Now, with that said, there's obviously periods in that time where I was also just pretty vacant, by my own admission. And, that shows up in the family. And, we mentioned weather and sports. I mean, I could numb out to just listening to a sports podcast or something and just being completely detached. Now, functionally, I could still change a diaper, but I wasn't engaged in the process. And those were showing up more and more frequently during that period of time. And now I feel that, I've recognized that. I can compartmentalize that, and I can also identify it real time when I'm sort of entering patterns that don't necessarily serve that kind of greater self-development and or family.
Yeah. I'm going to guess that as a professional person, you were also managing working from home for perhaps even the first time. And so there was the pressure of that as well. Am I guessing too much, or is that true?
No, absolutely. And, my employer at the time was very much on the kind of higher end of the caution spectrum. So, very early work from home was deployed, and kind of very late sort of return to office came. So it was probably a full kind of 2 years all told, where that was ongoing. And, we obviously had to adjust. Everybody had to adjust to that. But, being in that environment where there's like screaming children, it's not optimal for a work environment, and you try and make the best of it. But equally, that adds to some of the shame and doubt and concern in terms of your personal contribution. So oftentimes I'd find myself sort of locked away in an office, and it wasn't necessarily good for me. And, it's a period in time, obviously, that was pretty difficult, but I had the good fortune of being employed, and I know I'm sensitive to the fact that many had challenging periods during that pandemic period, that didn't have them that fortune. So it was the interesting part about men's work is recognizing that difference, where I can still have my emotion and my circumstance and be able to try and address it, and someone can simultaneously have a corresponding situation where maybe they lost their job or they didn't have a job, and it's okay for me to address me. I think that's where the men's work has really sort of elevated that sense that it's okay for me to have my emotion. My emotion is my emotion, and I can work through it. And equally, I can be sensitive simultaneously to someone else's scenario too, which maybe, on paper, it would feel like it's kind of a little bit kind of sort of misunderstanding in terms of where other people could be.
Right. Well, I think that comes with, so as we do men's work, and I have to be careful about this because I'm going to cast a pretty broad brush, but I'm going to stand behind this. As we do men's work and we begin to reconnect with ourselves and learn to love ourselves again, and learn to connect with our emotional experience, we also grow in empathy. And that empathy is what allows us to see other people's experience and allow them to have that experience and to empathize with it. And so, that what you are talking about is emblematic of that. I'm curious, Had there not been a pandemic, would you have gone home to see your mom?
Yeah, and towards the end I did spend a lot of time there. So it wasn't that I had zero access. I did have some. And I think some of those emotions would have been high either way, because it's a very cruel way to see someone pass, and knowing that someone's probably deteriorating a percentage a week for this last 6 months or so, and then spending time by their bedside towards the end, it's not something I would wish on anybody, for sure. And I think for me, the pandemic piece of it was just more about the kind of, I have a kind of sensitivity to death anyway. Like, my only past experiences were two of immense shock as a youngster. And they were starting to surface again during the pandemic, with all of the activities and, news of everything was, kind of fear and death related at every corner. And then simultaneously, my mum's circumstances weren't going to improve. So, I think that the most difficult period of that time was more about seeing sort of visions of the past, if you like, that took me into a space that I hadn't ever anticipated going to.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. For a lot of men who got to that point where you were like a zombie, where you were numbing out, for a lot of men, they're not aware of their emotions. And so they're not aware that they're numbing out. I'm getting the impression, though, that you were in contact with your emotions, and whether intentionally or unintentionally, you were beginning to numb out, and you were going to that zombie place. Were you connected to your emotional experience before you discovered men's work, or were you not?
I'd suggest probably not. In fact, I would say no. It's with retrospect that I can look back and think, wow, like, how different was I when, I was kind of zoned out, and just even to the fact that I'd walk the dog and just try and be detached from people. And, I was way within myself across pretty much every element of life. So I do think it's a post-men's work area that I'm certainly more aware of, largely because of the good structures I think that everyman certainly brings forward in terms of recognizing anger, recognizing shame, sadness, fear, joy, processing it, or working through it. Yeah. So I would never have been in a position back then to identify it in a way where I would be able to call it out real time, and I'd certainly not be in a position to confront it.
Yeah. So you find the group in Austin, you find everyman, you do fundamentals. And I'm curious, what was the experience of connecting with your emotions like? What was it like for you to finally realize, oh, this is what I was doing, and there's a way that I can do this that isn't doing that, or that I can do the exact opposite of that? What's that awakening like? What's that realization feel like?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey guys, it's Ator again. Sorry to interrupt the show, but I want to tell you about something I'm really excited about. If you've been listening for a while, you know how important it is to take time for self-reflection and growth. That's exactly why I've created the Ink and Authenticity Men's Creative Writing Workshop. This is a 6-session online workshop designed specifically for men. Whether you're looking to explore your identity, challenge societal expectations, or simply find a creative outlet to process your life, this workshop gives you the space to do that. It's not about being a professional writer. It's about telling your story, digging deep, and connecting with others on the same journey. Each session is filled with prompts and discussions that will help you understand yourself better, all in a supportive and open environment. So if you want a way to write, reflect, and share, join me for Ink and Authenticity. Just visit authenticityroad.online/workshop to learn more and register. Now let's get back to the show.
So I think it was more visible when I came back from Melt, where I felt that there was a big weight that was lifted. Those first 6 months or so pre-Melt, I think, it was a good training ground in terms of just the practice and the repeatability and having a community and a safety network. But the process, I think, really bedded in after Melt, knowing that, that we can talk to healing journeys, like a healing journey can serve you and also serve others in ways that you'd never really comprehended, making the connections just with people on such relatable stories. It doesn't always necessarily mean the story, it just the way that they're holding themselves and some of the things that show up for them are very relatable. So for me, the emotional part was visible when I returned back from Melt, and I think that Thursday after, 3 or 4 days after, I'd come off this massive high, and then I just kind of sunk to a bit of a low because I thought, wow, okay, this amazing community and outlet that was available to me that took me to a place where I was somewhat emotionally cleansed is now back in a remote world, and something I have to try and stay connected to. And as I say, I have the good fortune of our Austin group, and some don't. And I've stayed connected with a good kind of half a dozen men outside of our group since then, just because of the value of the exchanges that it brought.
Yeah. So for listeners who we've said the word Melt a bunch of times now. For listeners who maybe have not listened to previous podcasts, Melt is Everyman's men's emotional leadership training, which is a weekend retreat for men. It's held usually twice a year. And to that very point that you were just talking about, I remember my very first Melt, back in 2021, I think was my first Melt. And it's funny, that's only 2 years ago, but it seems like much, much longer ago than that. But I came back that Sunday, I was all pumped up. And then over the course of the week, the bottom dropped out. And I felt so empty and so bereft because, you spend 48 hours just in this unbelievably close contact. And it's odd because when you get there, you're strangers with all of these people. You don't know any of these guys. And by the time you leave, you never want to live without them. And so I remember describing to someone that, and I don't know where I got this metaphor, but that my chest felt like an elevator that had opened up and dumped out all of the people. And so now I just had this great big empty elevator in my chest that kept dropping down and not bringing back up any people. And that kind of withdrawal, I soon came to find out would happen every time I went to Melt. The second time I went as a facilitator. I went as a member of the leadership team. And then the third time, the time where I met you there, I was just a regular customer again. But every time coming home, like the first time I went back to work on the Monday, every other time I had scheduled time off after I got back because I knew that I was just going to be useless. But it's an incredibly emotional experience. And that emotional connection is unlike anything else. I didn't realize when I met you at Melt that you were so new to the work. I didn't realize that you had only been doing it for 6 months because you were a regular fixture around Everyman. I used to see you come to my morning meditations. And so you were a face that I recognized. And so to me, you were just, he's one of those guys who's just always been there. So I didn't realize your backstory. I didn't realize that it was new for you and that you were coming into the work that way.
Yeah, I was very much fresh meat, and and you were a bit of a celebrity, obviously, having been on the platform and had these great meditations with you, and recognize you from afar. And then also being in that space with 50 other men, I can't recall a period in my life, even with sports and everything else. I don't think I've been in a room with 50 guys before. Like, I kind of think back to, I wasn't at school with, I was at a mixed sex school. So there's no reason for that to happen. And I remember, I think I might have said it to you actually, how different the volume of the kind of eating room is on day 3 versus day 1, because everyone's kind of like, edgy, trying to find their way. And then towards the end, it's just, you've got these micro bursts of like powerful exchanges between people who are just going up to each other, and like 5 minutes in you feel like you've just met your long lost brother. And it's incredible that the way that the kind of hockey stick kind of elevates in terms of the quality of the weekend, sort of, towards the back end.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, and you sort of touched on it when you said you found your long lost brother, you're in a room with 50 men, but you're in a room with 50 guys who you would tell anything to, who you would just open up your guts and pour them out to, as opposed to, say, a locker room. You could be in a locker room with 50 guys, but you would never be this vulnerable. You would never say the things that you say to these men. And that's what's really unique about it.
Yeah, great.
So as long as we're on the topic of Melt, let's go there and talk about that. One of the things that Melt is known for is healing journeys. And as I have mentioned numerous times on the show, that last Melt in 2023, in March of 2023, I had an enormous healing journey. And I understand that you had activation around the same thing that activated me, that brought me to that place. I'm wondering if you're able to talk about that.
Yeah, so we were certainly sort of parallel spirits at that point in time. I think we were charged very much by the same prior share and healing journey that I think another brother was working through some grievances similar to mine in terms of passing of a family member. And I remember having to stand up and just step away. And, I was on the brink of tears myself, and I looked across the room and I saw you kind of holding similar form, I think, either crying or on the brink and shivering, and you clearly had support. I think you've spoken to Aaron about this previously as well. You had guys who were there for you immediately, whereby I knew I had something to confront because I was so heavily charged, but it was, it wasn't so evident that I was going to get there. And it actually felt cruel to me. I know when you left the room, and the team, the guys took you to your journey, Owen asked around the room like what their responses were to that healing journey. And I remember saying the word cruel. I think it felt cruel. I thought you're being cruel to him, and in terms of trying to antagonize anger. And as a result,
and to be clear, this was the man in the middle of the circle. This was not me, because I was already out of the room.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, certainly. So as a result, I kind of unintentionally end up putting your hand up, right, by saying, "Hey, that's cruel." And it's like, well, if you think that's cruel, let's talk about it. And as a result, I had the good fortune that I traveled with 3 or 4 of the other guys from Austin. So I did have that support there, and I knew I felt safe. And so they kind of took me into this space where trying to elevate and confront some of that anger and sadness that comes with losing a parent. I had pushed so much of that down and away, and I had also not really had much past experience with actively encouraging anger. I mean, I'm 6'5", 225 pounds. Like, generally speaking, it's not in my interest to get myself into trouble because the optics don't look good. I try not to be hangry. I try, generally speaking, try and be something of a gentle giant. So to really be in a space where, hey, no, you've got this sitting in your body and it's not healthy. We need to be in a space where we can help you extract some of that. And my healing journey took me to that place where, I was kind of somewhat held down by these guys. And I remember Owen saying I remember the word stoic. He said, "You're being really stoic. Why?" And I don't necessarily take that as a negative. I was just frozen. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to wrestle my way through. But I also now recognize that I was carrying a heavy weight in my body, and by trying to actually wrestle my way out from 2 or 3 guys, which was basically the method, I was in a struggle that shifted something in my body, and ultimately that release is, I would attribute to a large portion of the benefit I've received in the last 6 months or so.
So how, and you're actually going to help me by answering this question, because you're clarifying something for me that I've never really understood. How is it that wrestling with these guys, that pushing through the wall they created, the physical wall they created, and for those of you who have never seen a healing journey, so sometimes it can be like mine, just laying down on the ground and screaming my guts out while somebody holds me. But sometimes it's much more physical. And this is such an Owen way of doing the work. Owen Marcus from Everyman, who really sort of developed, who kind of brought the healing journey to where it is now, the iteration that it's in now. He will frequently set up a situation where a guy has to wrestle his way through a wall of other guys, or be held down on the ground and have to wrestle his way up from being held down. And I've always felt like that was it always felt like an artificial construct to me. Like, we're creating psychodrama here just for the sake of creating psychodrama. But you said something that may have shifted my view on that. And that is that having to wrestle through those guys shifted something inside you that helped you find the healing in the 6 months since. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that. What was it about wrestling them, and what was the shift that happened, and how did that help aid your healing?
Yeah, so it's a couple of things. I lean more towards what you were saying as a method. And actually, before I went to Melt, I had a kind of shivering incident in group. And I think that I actually am more of a natural kind of shiver, curl down on my knees and kind of cry out kind of guy. Like that would have been probably the sort of more natural healing path for me. And, Brent was actually involved in that healing journey. And he and I spoke about that a little bit. He knew me better, and he knew that could also be a way of dealing with this. So for me to be pushed into that anger state, I'm with you. I also felt really uncomfortable that this is kind of pushing to a point where taking someone out of their natural state and creating this discomfort, and it just didn't feel quite right. Now, what I would say with hindsight, now looking back, say 5 or 6 months later, is I can practice maybe a Tai Chi or a boxercise class, or even just think about where my energy and my space is with my body. And now getting in a situation where anger isn't alien to me or isn't something I can avoid. And even now, I drop in and occasionally scream into a pillow, or, if you want to punch a pillow or whatever, to get that physical connection to anger. I had suppressed anger so much that I at least now know I can comfortably exercise it in a different way. Now, wrestling is probably, it was a little extreme for me, but it also took me to a place where I was probably more comfortable to shout into a pillow and to punch a pillow. So it was a means to an end, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's what you helped shift for me, is that where I used to look at this and go, this is almost theatrical, intentionally theatrical, to get a rise out of people. I now see that there is something about evoking the physicality that maybe guys don't normally evoke. And so there's a method to his madness. And you know, and who am I to argue with Owen Marcus, because he's the master at this, and he, you know, people seek him out specifically for this, and he's known for doing amazing work with people. And so I don't want to be seen as criticizing his method. I just know that from the outside looking in, and I was taught this method. I mean, when I co-facilitated at a melt in 22, I did that under Owen's tutelage. He directed me step by step about getting the guys in there and holding the guy backward. And for me, it was, and I'm not giving away anyone's experience here, but basically it was me having the guys form a wall between this man and his spouse, and him having to break through that wall. And now that I'm hearing this, I'm going, oh, you know what? Maybe I understand now. Maybe there is something to the physical nature of this. So thank you for that. So in the 6 months since then, what's happened for you emotionally, healing wise, etc.?
So I certainly feel like I'm on a positive journey, like an onward path, which is one I want to stay on. I'm making way smarter choices. You know, I'm just indexing most elements of life towards the positive. So you know, I think a lot of it has come as a result of that. As I mentioned earlier, aside from recognizing like how my body feels and really actually trying to confront some of those things, like, hey, I've got a sore hip, let's try and do a somatic yoga release. Like, aside from that, actually being in a position to talk through the emotions is just so pivotal. So it really clears things up so much more, rather than just being this big mash of emotional mess that you don't really know how to distill. Like, am I angry? Am I in shame? Like, and you don't really know. So now I'm in a spot where I feel like I can identify those things. I can also look back to how I'd managed those things in the past and try and address them differently today. And more crucially, I actually really want to try and find an onward way of pushing this into how I parent. And, you know, I think there's so much good that can come from men's work at large, in terms of just educating people on how to function, you know, with their emotions, that I actually want to try and encourage that, you know, with my children as well. And if we look back in time, I mean, probably a year ago, I would have discouraged a screaming child from releasing their frustrations, you know, standard parenting procedure in terms of how most of us were raised, like children should be seen, not heard type thinking.
Right.
And now I'm actually had moments last week, you know, where I'm screaming into a pillow next to my 3-year-old son who's screaming into a pillow. I mean, how bizarre is that? And we're going there, you know, and I don't know if that's good, bad, or different, but he gets to a way more settled state quicker. We bond pretty quick off the back of that. Right. And at this point in time, I see more upside than down.
Yeah. You know, self-regulation is where it's at, right? Self-regulation is what we're seeking to do. And you're teaching a toddler something that toddlers are not known for. I'm curious. I mean, now that you've sort of opened this door on raising your kids, and you have one boy and one girl?
Yes, I have a 7-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son.
Right. You know, girls are given the palette of emotions and boys are not. Boys are taught you can be angry or you can be happy, and that's about it. I'm curious if having done this work or in the process of doing this work is changing the way that you're raising your son. Are you going to teach him to be a man in a different way than you learned to be a man?
So one thing I will say, I and this isn't a criticism of my upbringing. I was super fortunate, two great parents, very privileged upbringing. One thing I would acknowledge is a generational pattern of parenting. My father was raised by his grandparents, and so you could even look back and say, hey, the experience of teaching a 3 or 4 year old is like 100 years plus old when you start looking back at the generations. And my dad and I had a conversation about when he visited the last time with my 3-year-old son, and he sort of said, my experiences with a 3-year-old is 40 years old. And I actually kind of thought about it. Well, actually, if what you're applying is what your grandparents applied to you, then it's more than 100 years old. Right. So I am really quite mindful of that as to how I try and look at the generational patterns of parenting and try and strip it down to some of the basics. I mentioned sort of stoicism earlier, and I do see some value in that. Listen to a Daily Dad podcast, which is a great resource, and they kind of strip it down in terms of you just have to regularly tell your kids that they're safe and regularly tell them that they're loved before age 7. And then probably after about age 7, start talking to them about opportunities in which they can explore to be enough for themselves. And it's basically those 3 pillars. So I frequently find myself, said it about an hour ago to my son, like, do you feel safe? Do you feel loved? And I think probably I'm going to step into maybe moving that more to an affirmation as they grow up so that they feel it a little bit more versus being something that I'm kind of just questioning them on. But ultimately, those are the foundational things that as a parent, I just need to get right, that they just feel loved and they just feel safe. And everything from there is a bonus.
Yeah. I don't have a lot of experience with kids. Does a 3-year-old understand the question, do you feel safe or do you feel loved? Do they have that vocabulary?
Mine has pretty rich vocabulary. I do think, and I've started to insert it at a point where we're observing him expressing certain emotions, like I love you. If he says I love you, then I feel comfortable to ask that question, do you feel loved? Yeah. It wasn't prior to that because, as with any child, you'd probably say, I love you every night. And so even at an early age, they've got to understand it. I don't know enough about childhood development to know if they truly integrate it. But at this point in time, it feels sincere that he understands that emotion and the value of it. Safety is a different one. Safety is an unknown because in some ways, the default for many children, and let me just caveat, this isn't the case for every child, okay? But the default operating model for most children is I'm safe. Like, why would I think about the contrary? Right. Unless they're experiencing some sort of kind of neglect or trauma. And so I think that there's probably a longer term understanding around that safety. And if I'm doing it where I'm holding him and we're talking through it in the context of a tantrum or a difficult moment with his sister, then I think he understands it in that context. Yeah. But it's a really good question. It's because it's made me think about, is it too early? Is it the right thing? But I think up to this point in time, at this age, those are the 2 pillars that I want to kind of hold my parenting to the most.
Yeah. Yeah, because the reason I asked the question is because if you ask me if I feel safe, I mean, I feel safe until I don't. Like if you ask me if I feel safe right now, sure, I feel safe. But then when something happens that makes me feel unsafe, then I feel unsafe. So it's, what I'm saying? It's a hard concept for me. And so I'm thinking it's a hard concept for a 3-year-old, but I think the value that I see in what you're doing is that even if he doesn't quite have it conceptually, you're building the blocks for him to put it in place. I've been asked this question multiple times. So what does that mean to me? And how do I continue to answer that question? So I think that's amazing. I think he's a very lucky kid. I think both your kids are very lucky kids to have a dad who's sort of thinking about child rearing in these ways, in these terms.
Bless you. Thank you. And, and just to cycle back on your comment about your own personal safety, I'd question, is there something maybe in your formative years that was grounding you to feel unsafe, where as an adult at this point in time in this conversation, you're now in a space where you feel safe until you don't? Is there something there where more safety in an early age would change that view?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how much you've heard of my backstory, but my dad was a violent alcoholic who was physically and emotionally abusive to my mother and my siblings, not to me, because we got out of the house before he really had a chance. But he would live away from our house during the week. He would come home Friday evenings and then leave again on Sunday evening. And that 48-hour window from Friday to Sunday were 48 hours of sheer terror. And so I was safe until he got home. Once he got home, I wasn't safe. So yeah, had I had that safety of I'm always safe, not I'm safe until I'm not, I might look at this differently. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm sorry you had to experience that, and thank you for dropping into that. If you're okay with us going back into that space.
Yeah, sure. Of course I am. One of the things you were talking about earlier that I want to kind of go back to is being a zombie, numbing out, finding men's work, making the emotional connection with yourself, all of that. If 1 year ago I had said the sentence, "What are you feeling and where are you feeling it?" how might you have responded?
I think the only sensation I had in those sort of preceding 3 years was recognizing that my chest was always tight. And I actually had a couple of sort of, I think it's called vasovagal syncope, like a couple of those fainting incidents in around that sort of month when my mum passed away. So I know that like my breathing was just wrong. I was breathing solely through my lungs. It was always tight. That was always where, what I now know is anxiety was sitting. So that would have been the only area where I would have carried it into the men's work, because it was evident. It was affecting my, I was literally having episodes. Now I'm a bit more kind of broad in my perspective in terms of just the body awareness, and also having the methods to work some of that through. So, grateful for you for the meditations and getting into that space where, I'm breathing better through my belly, box breathing, all those sorts of things. And then augmenting it with, all the methods we spoke about to try and be in a place where I'm confronting it. So a year ago, it would have been just that, but anything else, it would have not been there. And then I also think as a result of having a meditation practice of sorts, pretty frequent for me, I'm also in a place where I'm actively trying to sort of elevate my awareness. The sort of way I'm looking at it the moment is I feel like I'm trying to put myself above the Rubik's Cube, if so to speak. If the Rubik's Cube is just this collection of thoughts, and every thought has a different color, and some days there's way too much red, and you're in the cube. Like I'm in the cube.
Right.
I'm really trying to step away and just like look down on the cube and say, okay, there's a bit of red today. Like let's just leave that there and not fall into it, not stay in it, because I've had many of those incidents before where you just latch onto one thought, and that thought becomes your identity, and then your identity becomes your shame, and then your shame, and you spiral. So I want to stop that. So, just opening up my heart and my awareness more broadly in the last year, I think has also opened my kind of intellectual perspective in terms of how these things work, and being motivated to be in a place where I'm kind of looking down on myself. I'm talking to my older self, talking to my younger self, really trying to guide the best version of me in the present moment. Because, if I'm there, then the past and the future can't hurt me.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I hammer all the time in those meditations is, the reason that we focus on our breath is because our breath is always present. There's no future breathing or past breathing. There is only the breathing that I'm doing right now. And so that practice of staying in the present is the key. It's the trick. And even when I coach people, I always kind of, I always want to say, look, the secret to almost everything is being present. Because when you're spinning out into future fear, or when you're replaying past regrets, you're not dealing with what needs to be dealt with. So just being present solves a multitude of problems. I want to let folks listening know that Ross is probably the best prepared guest that I've ever had on the show, because before the show, he sent me a list of things saying, here are things we can talk about. And he also anticipated my 2 questions that I ask at the end of every episode. But I'm going to hold you to answering those without resorting to your pre-written answers. But one of the things that you asked on your list, on your sheet here of things we could talk about, is really intriguing me. And that is, you asked, how has everyman opened access to gay men? Oh, no, I'm sorry. So it's not a question. You're saying everyman opened access to gay men like you hadn't had before. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah. So, I'm interested to get your perspective on this, because it's just by circumstance and chance. Like I haven't had many experiences with gay men, like in terms of just interactions. And I met like 3, one of 3 very, very beautiful souls, of guys who are gay at Mel. And I'd wondered whether it was kind of considered to be more of a safe space, relative to society at large. And also maybe that's part of my evolution or maturity too, in terms of just being way more comfortable and available to kind of new audiences. And so, yeah, I'm interested to get your perspective on it.
Yeah. I found it a fascinating sort of question, because, I don't get straight guys asking me about my experience as a queer identified man very often. And so when I do get the opportunity to answer the question, I will. You asked, to get my perspective on whether everyman is representative and safer for LGBTQ. Well, I can't speak on behalf of the L's because we don't have any inside of everyman. Yep. By definition.
That was a bit of a typo. Sorry about that.
But my story around that is this. When I first discovered everyman, I actually sent an email to Lucas and said, hi, I'm a gay man. Am I going to be comfortable here? Am I going to be safe here? Because the notion of joining a group of an untold number of men was incredibly scary to me, because men were never safe, right? Because men were the source of the pain and the bullying and the exclusion and all of that. And so do I really want to join a club of the people who are the source of my pain. And Lucas responded with, you're totally welcome here. You're totally safe here. In fact, here's Mike Sagoon's email. Here's Cater Sparks's email. They've both been guests on the show. Talk to them. They'll help you understand. And so I kind of got here and I still felt awkward about it. I still felt like, well, I have to start every interaction with, just so you know, I'm gay, until I realized I didn't have to do that because, does this feel safer than society at large? Absolutely. But it's not just because it's a more welcoming space for gay men, right? If I were anything outside of the mainstream, I would feel safer here just because those are the men who congregate at Everyman, right? The guys who congregate here are here to do the work. And I shouldn't say here. This podcast is not part of Everyman. It just so happens that that's how Ross and I know each other. And a lot of the people who have been on the show have been part of the group. But because these are our men who are committed to doing their work and who are committed to being empathetic to other people's experiences, they are just by nature safer. These are not guys who I ever fear. And, that's what this work does. It opens you up and it allows you to be empathetic to other people's experiences. And so, it's safer than the world at large, but not just because I'm gay. It's safer than the world at large just because it's safer than the world at large for everybody.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. It's not specific to that group. I was just interested to get your perspective on that group. And but you're right. It is an environment of high emotional intelligence and high empathy. Therefore,
Right.
By definition, it should be a safer space. It's certainly been eye-opening to me to be able to hold space, probably for the first time for periods of time with gay men, and it's it's new to me, and that's about it. I mean, it's like, but it's been eye-opening.
Yeah. I mean, I don't consider myself to be a source of internalized homophobia. I think I've pretty much conquered that, but I will confess that for the longest time, particularly as I was learning to be a facilitator, I always felt like I had to go out of my way to say, when I give you a hug or when I put my hand on you or whatever, it's not because I have some ulterior motive, or I'm not concerned about your emotional experience because I have a romantic charge or something like that. I felt obligated to tell straight guys, you don't need to fear me because I'm gay. And I don't do that anymore because in all of the time that I was doing that, the response was always, yeah, I know. I'm not that didn't even occur to me until you brought it up. It never even occurred to me that you were thinking of me in a sexualized manner until you brought it up.
Right.
And so I've stopped bringing it up because it's not present for them. And it's certainly not present for me. And so why am I bringing an elephant into the room who wasn't in the room for either of us to begin with?
Yeah, that's absolutely.
Well, we are coming toward the end of our time together. And as you know, there are the two questions that we ask every guest. And so I'm going to ask you the first one because you're on the hot seat. It's your turn. What does authenticity mean to you?
Yeah, so for me, I kind of alluded to a little bit about presence earlier on in terms of just being that spot where you're not distracted by the past and the future. But I also kind of point more towards my approach to happiness at large, in terms of I'm at my most authentic when I'm at my goofiest, generally speaking. And that's when what I say and what I do and what I feel are all the same. So, and I think that's kind of a pretty common definition of happiness, in fact. So for me to be authentic, like, I want to have a degree of kind of joviality to me. And I feel that in my body, and obviously then want to relay it in what I say. And if those three are in unison, then for me that kind of lines up to a place where I can kind of comfortably say I'm authentic.
Beautiful. Thank you. And the second question is, what do you wish that I had asked you that I didn't ask you?
I think I'd like to have spoken a little bit about joy. And I sometimes feel like so many of our conversations, and certainly the emotions, probably 4 of the 5, point negative, versus joy, which tends to point positive. And I think sometimes, certainly what I've observed in group, is we're either kind of late to recognize joy or uncomfortable almost in the shame of joy, so to speak, because if someone's in a really difficult spot and, in sadness or in anger, then it's kind of not particularly emotionally intelligent to jump up and say, hey, I'm really happy about my life today. But we should be celebrating joy. And I certainly want to do that by kind of honoring, my wife, especially, for being so supportive. I know that there's a lot of families, guys, relationships, partners that are super strong and actually hold it all together in many ways for someone who's on a parallel journey and doing the work. So, maybe this is for another podcast, but I'd certainly be interested to hear the stories of other halves who are in the room alongside someone who's doing independent work. They're the heroes as far as I'm concerned, and they're more than just a passenger in this thing.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring up other halves, because I've always felt it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? So on the one hand, I want to tell my spouse, you're getting an upgrade because I'm a better version of myself today than I was when I started this journey. But on the other hand, I also want to say, I'm sorry, because I am not the person you met and fell in love with. I'm not the man you thought you were going to spend the rest of your life with. And so therefore, I've changed the rules of the game in the middle of the game. And that's not fair to you. And it's a double-edged sword. I'm not sure. And I think it's very situational. I think for some couples, the partner wakes up and says, you're not the person I married and I'm unhappy with this. And for some couples, the partner wakes up and says, you are knocking it out of the park, baby, and I love you even more because of what you've done to improve yourself. And there's no judgment from me on either of those sides because they are both valid. They're both valid responses to someone having an immense life change.
That's beautiful. And actually, I feel charged by that. And what you described, in part, I think, is some of the shame that for that period of time that I spoke of during the pandemic. It was knowing that, my wife and I have been together 8 years, but no longer. But knowing that in that middle point, I wasn't the guy that she met the first 6 months, and I wasn't showing up, and I wasn't, what she'd signed up for. And she never said that.
Right.
But I still feel there's work to do to pay it back because, she's been such a crucial element to supporting me through the toughest passage of my life.
Yeah. And you're carrying that, and the audience can't see your face, but I can. And I can see the weight of that in your face. I would love to get your response to a little pushback. And I'm curious as to how you'll respond to this. Earlier, when I asked you about, what do you wish I'd asked you? And you said you wanted to talk about joy. And you said of the 5 major emotions, 4 of them point negative and 1 of them points positive. And I strenuously disagree. To me, there is no such thing as a positive or a negative emotion. Each emotion serves a purpose and a noble purpose. And anger does, and sadness does, shame does. Anger is my line in the sand. Anger is, you don't have the right to violate me. That's positive. Sadness is, something bad happened and I feel it because I am an emotional, empathetic person. Shame is evolutionarily valuable because it aligns us with the values of our community. Fear keeps us from getting eaten by saber-toothed tigers. And joy is joy, right? We covered that. So I'm curious, as I say this, as I push back that there is no positive or negative, how does that land with you?
I welcome the pushback. It's an interesting discussion, for sure. I hadn't really thought about that in terms of emotions not being negative or positive. I was thinking more in the context of spaces that I've held with others. Mm-hmm. Typically, if someone is in anger, typically if someone is in shame, typically if they're in sadness or in fear, they are in a quasi-negative state. Mm-hmm. Now, I totally agree that if they work through that, they can get to a positive state where the net outcome was great and it was good. And you're right. I don't think emotions should be labeled that way. Because probably I should reframe it and say my experience of observing others in those states typically indexes that way towards a negative, and is a negative in terms of the weight of the work. Right. It's how it sits with me, the discomfort with me. So if 4 of the 5 are hard going and we kind of pass over joy because we almost kind of run out of time for it, it's pretty heavy going, right? And that's why we're in the work. It was more about the experiential side of it, but thank you for clarifying the emotional piece.
Yeah, I mean, the reason it's important to me to clarify that is because when you're doing this work with other men, I want them to feel all of the feels and to not shy away from certain feelings because they're negative or because, well, you'll judge me if I get angry or you'll think I'm weak if I am sad. And I always like to tell people that emotions are just data. They just are telling us what we feel. They're not telling us what we are. But the reason that I pushed back and the reason I brought it up is because these kinds of conversations are like catnip to me. And I could just play with this like a ball of yarn all evening.
And I'm learning from this stuff. So I'm all open ears on that. So I certainly don't want to clarify anything to be incorrect, but thank you for doing that. Yeah, no,
true. I mean, you're welcome. But I don't even, your welcome's wrong. I mean, it's really just thank you. Thank you for opening up that line of conversation. Well, although you've answered my 2 questions, and so ordinarily this would be the time that we would close up shop, I feel like there's still something I want from you, and I don't know what it is. And I'm wondering what it is that you're sitting with right now that you would like to share that would help you feel complete around having been a guest today.
I think it's along the lines of some thank yous, especially the Austin guys, I'd certainly want to thank for being so supportive along the way. And I know I mentioned, my wife and family. I think it's really important we step into that. And also, when I talk about joy and kind of wanting to elevate joy, I think it's more that so much of everyman's work is about relatability between other men. And, a lot of the instances you come across is maybe there's, a separation, or maybe there's like a childhood custody issue or something like that. And those are like typical audiences that you confront. But probably as typical audience is people who are getting by in their dynamic with their spouse, significant other, their family. And, if anything, I kind of want to be that relatable voice of men who have amazing support mechanisms. They're very blessed within their core life, but they also have to extract something else out of themselves. And this community really enables that. And so I really want to extend my thanks to so many of the men who I've had the good fortune to interact with across meditations, across Melt, text messages, phone calls, in person. The brotherhood thing is really incredible, especially for someone who has moved away from family and can feel quite alone quite frequently. So I really want to extend some thanks.
Wow. Thank you for taking the space to do that. And two things that you said make me want to comment. One is that joy does get shortchanged a lot in these spaces when we're doing men's work, because guys show up in men's workspaces because things have stopped working. And when you're overjoyed, that's not when you feel like things have stopped working, right? And so as we're doing the work, we tend to focus on those colors that feel darker. We tend to focus on the areas where we're feeling pain. And so, yeah, joy does get shortchanged. And guys often feel embarrassed to talk about their wins. Don't know why, but a lot of times it's just easier to talk about your losses than it is your wins. The other thing that I want to respond to is this notion of brotherhood. And that is that I never felt brotherhood with my blood relative brothers, with my family of birth. But these men that I've met through doing this work have become not just my brothers, but more than brothers, and my tribe and my people and my family. And I never expected to find that. I never expected that one day I was going to wake up and have, 100 men that I could call and they wouldn't ask, why are you calling me? They would just be glad to hear my voice. That's amazing. Where do you find that? Where does a modern man find that kind of relationship? So, yeah.
Well, and sorry to extend us a little further, but I do think that one of the other things that's evident with everyman is typically the profiled sorts of points in that sort of 35 to 65-year-old space. And I think that probably 15 to 25-year-olds are really deficient when it comes to this sense of community as well. I really hope that every man can find a pathway to kind of maybe entice and energize some of those younger communities so that, this sort of more disenfranchised youth have a safe place to be.
Yeah. And not just every man, but all men's work organizations and all men who do men's work independently. I know when I was 15 or 16, this would have been life-changing for me to know that I am loved in this way. Would have been incredible. So, all right. Well, that being said, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to Ross Taylor for being here tonight and Ross, I know that if Jordan were here, he would thank you as well. You guys got to interact somewhat at Melt, and so I'm sure he would have loved to have seen you. And with that, it is time to throw the bags in the back of the jalopy and head back out onto the Authenticity Road. So, on behalf of the show, I am Ettore, and until we meet again, please be authentic. Goodbye, everyone. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe so you're notified when a new episode is posted.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope what you've heard will help you on the road to your personal authenticity.
Visit us at www.authenticityroad.online.